There are moments in a woman's life when the world divides itself cleanly into before and after, when a single overheard conversation or a carelessly spoken truth cleaves time in two and leaves her standing in the wreckage of everything she believed. And for Eleanor Ashworth, that moment came on an autumn afternoon, when the light was golden and the air smelled of dying leaves, and she returned home early from paying calls with a headache pounding behind her eyes, moving quietly through the modest townhouse so as not to disturb anyone, her soft-soled shoes making no sound on the worn carpet of the upstairs hallway as she approached her father's study and heard, through the door left carelessly ajar, the voice of Lord Clarence Pemberton, her betrothed of 2 years, the man she loved with all the hopeful certainty of her 21 years, the man whose ring she wore and whose name she expected to carry for the rest of her life. And she stopped there in the hallway, with her hand raised to knock because something in his tone made her blood run cold, a casual cruelty she had never heard from him before. And then the words came, each one a blade sliding between her ribs. The girl herself was never the attraction. Pleasant enough, but hardly a diamond, and without the fortune, I'm afraid I must look elsewhere. Do give her my regards, and perhaps suggest she lower her expectations considerably. And there was laughter in his voice, actual laughter, as though he found the destruction of her future mildly amusing. And she heard her father's broken response, the guilt and shame in his voice as he apologized for the failed investment that had cost them nearly everything, and Clarence's dismissive reply about having narrowly escaped shackling himself to a woman of no particular beauty or fortune. And Eleanor stood frozen in that hallway, her grey eyes, the colour of storm clouds before rain, her mother had always said, wide with a devastation so complete that she could not breathe, could not move, could only press her fingertips together until her knuckles ached, a gesture that would become her armour in the years to come. And then she fled, silent as a ghost, down the back stairs, and through the kitchen, and out into the garden where her mother's white camellia tree stood in the corner, its petals scattered across the ground like snow or tears, and she sank onto the cold stone bench beneath its branches and pressed her hands together so tightly that her fingers went numb, and she made herself a promise there among the fallen petals, a vow spoken only in the silence of her shattered heart. I will never again be foolish enough to believe that anyone could want me for myself. I will expect nothing, hope for nothing, and therefore never be wounded so deeply again. And when she finally returned inside an hour later, her face composed into the dignified mask her late mother had taught her to wear, Clarence had gone without seeking her out, without even asking to see her, and that final confirmation of her worthlessness settled into her bones like winter, and she knew that the girl who had believed in love had died beneath the camellia tree, and whoever rose in her place would be wiser, colder, and utterly determined never to hope again. 2 years passed like water wearing away at stone, slow and relentless and quiet, and Eleanor Ashworth learned to carry her grief the way her mother had taught her to carry herself, with spine straight and chin level, with dignity that cost her everything and showed nothing. And on a morning in early spring, when the light was pale and uncertain, and the first tentative buds were appearing on the trees outside her window, she sat in her modest bedroom in the diminished townhouse that was all they could now afford, a worn volume of Shakespeare's sonnets open in her lap, the pages soft with age and use, a book that had belonged to her mother and still smelled faintly of the lavender sachets she had kept in her drawers, and Eleanor read the familiar words without truly seeing them. Her grey eyes, still the colour of storm clouds before rain, still too expressive for her own comfort, moving over the lines, while her mind wandered through the ruins of what her life had become. She was 23 now, no longer the hopeful girl who had believed in love and promises and the goodness of handsome men with golden hair and easy smiles. and the 2 years since Clarence Pemberton had shattered her illusions had taught her lessons she had never wanted to learn. He had married his heiress within a month of breaking their engagement, Miss Arabella Kingsley with her £40,000 and her fashionable connections, and Eleanor had heard through the whispers that inevitably reached her that the marriage was not a happy one, that Lady Pemberton was beautiful but cold, extravagant but barren, and that Clarence had gained his fortune only to lose his peace. But this knowledge brought Eleanor no satisfaction, only a weary confirmation that the world was exactly as disappointing as she had come to believe. She had refused 2 offers of marriage in the years since, one from a widowed merchant twice her age who wanted a mother for his children, another from a young curate whose earnest devotion could not disguise his weak chin and weaker prospects, preferring dignified poverty to unions that would have required her to pretend feelings she could not summon, and her father had not pressed her, though she saw the guilt in his eyes every time he looked at her, the weight of what his failed investment had cost her pressing down upon his shoulders until he seemed to grow smaller with each passing month. Her hands rested open and relaxed upon the book, a rare moment of peace in the quiet morning. But that peace shattered when she heard her father's footsteps on the stairs, quicker than usual, and his voice calling her name with an agitation that made her fingertips press together before she had even closed the sonnets. She found him in the parlour, pacing before the cold fireplace, a letter clutched in his trembling hand, and when he turned to face her, his expression was a confusion of hope and fear that made her heart clench with protective dread. "You deserve so much more than what I can give you now, my dear," he said, the words tumbling out as though he had been rehearsing them. "Your mother would be ashamed of what I have done to your future. But, Eleanor, there may be, I scarcely dare to hope, there may be an opportunity." And he pressed the letter into her hands, and she read the brief, formal lines that announced the Duke of Thornfield's intention to call upon them the following day to discuss a matter of mutual benefit. And Eleanor knew the Duke only by reputation. Wealthy beyond measure, powerful in Parliament, widowed these 7 years, and notably cold, a man who had retreated from society after his wife's death and shown no interest in rejoining it. And she could not imagine what business such a man might have with the ruined Ashworths. But her father's desperate hope was painful to witness, and so she folded the letter carefully and said, in the measured voice that had become her armour, "Then we shall receive him, father, and hear what he has to say." Though she expected nothing, hoped for nothing, and told herself that whatever came, she would not allow herself to be wounded so deeply again. The Duke of Thornfield arrived precisely at 3 o'clock on an afternoon when the sky hung low and grey over London, threatening rain that had not yet fallen, and Eleanor stood at the parlour window, watching his carriage approach with a strange calm that felt like armour, her fingertips pressed together in the folds of her skirt where no one could see. And when he entered the room, she understood immediately why society spoke of him in hushed tones, for he was not handsome in the way Clarence had been handsome. There was nothing soft or pretty about him, nothing designed to charm, but rather he possessed a presence that seemed to fill the modest parlour until the walls themselves felt inadequate to contain him. Tall and broad-shouldered, with the powerful frame of a man who had never shied from labour, his dark blue eyes sweeping the room and cataloguing everything in a single glance, before settling upon her with an intensity that made her breath catch. And as he passed her to take the seat her father offered, she caught the scent of him, sandalwood and leather, with something beneath it like wood smoke, and the unexpected intimacy of knowing how a stranger smelled made her cheeks warm, despite her determination to feel nothing. He wasted no time on pleasantries, speaking in clipped, efficient sentences that cut through her father's nervous attempts at small talk like a blade through silk, and within moments he had laid bare his purpose with a brutal honesty that left Eleanor stunned. He required a wife, not for love, he was clear about this, almost coldly so, but for practical reasons, an heir for his estates, a mistress for his household, a companion who would not expect romantic attachment or make emotional demands, and he had observed her from a distance through his godmother, Lady Beatrice Montgomery, who had known her mother, and he believed her to be sensible, dignified, and unlikely to burden him with expectations he could not meet. He offered a straightforward transaction: marriage in exchange for complete financial security for herself and her father, debts paid, futures secured, nothing more and nothing less. Eleanor forced herself to think clearly despite the roaring in her ears, and she asked him questions, pointed, practical questions about her role, about his expectations, about what precisely he wanted from this arrangement. And he answered each one with the same direct efficiency, his deep baritone never wavering, his expression revealing nothing. But when she asked, her voice softer than she intended, whether he ever expected to feel affection for a second wife, something shifted. His hands, those large scarred hands she had noticed when he entered, curled slowly into fists at his sides, and a muscle flexed near his temple, and for just a moment the coldness cracked, and she glimpsed something beneath it, something that looked almost like pain. "I will not promise you love," he said, and his voice had dropped lower, rougher, as though the words cost him something. "I am not certain I am capable of it any longer, but I give you my word that you will never want for anything. You will never be treated with disrespect, and you will never have cause to regret this arrangement. I protect what is mine." She asked for time to consider one day, and he granted it without argument, rising to leave with the same controlled efficiency with which he had arrived. And as Eleanor watched him go, the grey sky darkening beyond the window, she found herself thinking not of his cold proposal, but of those fisted hands, of the grief hidden beneath his armour, and she wondered what had broken him so thoroughly that he believed himself incapable of love. Eleanor did not sleep that night, though she lay in her narrow bed with the worn quilt pulled to her chin, and her eyes fixed on the window where the grey sky pressed against the glass like something waiting to be let in. And her mind turned over the Duke's proposal again and again, as though examining a strange jewel from every angle, searching for the flaw she knew must be hidden somewhere within its cold, practical facets. She thought of Clarence, of his golden hair and easy smile, of the 2 years she had spent believing herself loved and cherished, of the moment that belief had shattered into pieces so small she was still finding them embedded in her heart, and she found herself comparing the two men in ways that surprised her. Clarence, with his pretty promises that had meant nothing, the Duke with his blunt refusal to promise what he could not give, and strangely, terribly, she found the Duke's honesty more comforting than all of Clarence's honeyed words had ever been. At least she would know exactly what she was getting. At least she would not be made a fool again. She pressed her fingertips together beneath the blankets, feeling the familiar ache of that gesture, and she whispered to herself in the darkness the vow she had made 2 years ago beneath her mother's camellia tree. "I will expect nothing, hope for nothing, and therefore never be wounded so deeply again." The threatening grey sky beyond her window seemed to echo her mood, heavy with storms that had not yet broken, and she watched the clouds shift and darken until dawn crept reluctantly over London, and she rose to dress with hands that trembled only slightly. Her father was waiting for her in the parlour, his face a map of conflicting emotions, hope and guilt and desperate love all warring for dominance. And when she told him her decision, his eyes filled with tears that he tried to hide by turning toward the window. "You do not have to do this, my dear," he said, his voice rough. "I would never ask you to sacrifice your happiness for my mistakes." But Eleanor crossed to him and took his hands in hers and said with a calm she did not entirely feel, "I have already learned that love matches are illusions, Father, and practical arrangements are safer. I will accept, and I will make the best of it. And you must not blame yourself any longer." She did not tell him that some small secret part of her had noticed the way the Duke's hands had curled into fists when she asked about affection, the way his cold mask had cracked for just a moment to reveal something raw beneath. And she did not tell him that this glimpse of hidden feeling had lodged itself in her chest like a splinter she could not quite reach. The Duke arrived at the appointed hour, precisely punctual, and Eleanor met him in the parlour with her spine straight and her chin level and her hands carefully relaxed at her sides, and she gave him her answer in a voice that did not waver. Yes, she would marry him. Something flickered in his dark blue eyes. Surprise, perhaps, or relief, or something she could not name. But his expression remained controlled as he informed her that the wedding would take place in 2 weeks at his estate, Thornfield Manor. He rose to take his leave, and when he reached for her hand to bow over it in formal farewell, his fingers closed around hers with unexpected warmth, and as he released her, his thumb brushed across her knuckles in a gesture so brief she might have imagined it, a whisper of tenderness that sent an unexpected jolt through her entire body. She told herself it meant nothing as she watched his carriage disappear into the grey afternoon, but her hand tingled where he had touched her, and she pressed her fingertips together to still their trembling, and she wondered what she had just agreed to become. The wedding took place in a small chapel on the outskirts of London. Grey stone walls and narrow windows through which the threatening sky pressed close, and Eleanor moved through the ceremony as though watching herself from a great distance, her voice clear and steady as she spoke vows that bound her to a man she barely knew, feeling the weight of his ring slide onto her finger. Heavy gold, warm from his pocket, fitting as though it had been made for her hand alone, while her father wept quietly in the front pew, and Lady Beatrice Montgomery sat ramrod straight beside him, her sharp eyes missing nothing of the proceedings. The Duke's voice was low and sure as he pledged himself to her, no hesitation in his words, no tremor in his hands as he held hers, and when the vicar pronounced them man and wife, Eleanor felt the finality of it settle into her bones like the first chill of winter, not unpleasant but undeniable, a door closing behind her on everything she had been before this moment. Lady Beatrice intercepted her before she could reach the carriage, one gloved hand catching Eleanor's elbow with surprising strength, and those knowing eyes studied her face with an intensity that made Eleanor want to look away, but could not. "You're not what I expected," Lady Beatrice said, her voice pitched low so that only Eleanor could hear. "You're better, and mark my words, child, before the year is out, that stubborn godson of mine will be making a fool of himself over you, and I shall enjoy watching every moment of it." Before Eleanor could formulate a response, Lady Beatrice had released her and stepped back, a small, satisfied smile playing about her lips, and then the Duke was there, offering his arm to escort her to the waiting carriage, and Eleanor took it without thinking, feeling the solid warmth of him through the layers of his coat and her gloves. The carriage was smaller than she had expected, or perhaps he was simply larger, his presence filling the enclosed space until Eleanor was acutely aware of every breath he took, every shift of his weight on the leather seat across from her, the scent of sandalwood and leather and wood smoke that she was beginning to associate with him alone, that seemed to wrap around her in the confined space, like something almost tangible. He did not speak, his dark blue eyes fixed on the passing landscape beyond the window, and Eleanor found herself studying him in profile, the strong line of his jaw, the slight furrow between his brows, the way his hands rested on his thighs, large and still, and somehow patient. And she wondered what he was thinking, whether he felt any of the strange, weighted anticipation that hummed beneath her skin. The silence stretched between them, not quite uncomfortable but heavy with everything unsaid, with the enormity of what they had just done, and Eleanor was searching for something to say, some small comment about the weather or the journey ahead, when the carriage lurched violently over a rut in the road, and she was thrown forward, her balance lost entirely. His hand shot out before she could fall, strong fingers gripping her elbow through the fabric of her sleeve, steadying her with a gentleness that seemed at odds with the speed of his reaction, and for a moment they were frozen there. His hand on her arm, her face inches from his chest, close enough that she could hear the steady rhythm of his heart. He released her the moment she was stable, pulling back as though her touch had burned him, but his fingers seemed to linger a fraction of a second longer than necessary, his thumb brushing against her sleeve in a gesture so brief she might have imagined it, and the warmth of his hand remained imprinted on her skin long after he had withdrawn. Eleanor settled back into her seat, her pulse unsteady, and when she glanced at him, she found him staring at his own palm with a strange expression, something between confusion and wonder, before he turned deliberately back to the window and the grey sky beyond. She pressed her fingertips together in the folds of her skirt, that familiar gesture of self-control, but for the first time in 2 years, she felt something crack in the walls she had built around her heart, a tiny fissure through which something dangerously like hope began to seep, and she told herself firmly that it meant nothing, that she must expect nothing, even as the distant thunder rumbled its disagreement across the darkening sky. Thornfield Manor rose from the landscape like something born of the earth itself, grey stone walls climbing toward the threatening sky, ivy cascading down ancient facades in dark green rivers, and Eleanor felt her breath catch in her throat as the carriage rounded the final curve of the drive and the full scope of her new home revealed itself before her, vast and beautiful and utterly forbidding in a way that made her feel very small and very alone. The Duke handed her down from the carriage with the same careful formality he had shown throughout their brief acquaintance, his gloved fingers steady beneath her elbow, and she was grateful for the support because her knees felt uncertain beneath her, though she kept her spine straight and her chin level as her mother had taught her, as she had learned to do in the face of every humiliation and disappointment life had offered her. The household staff stood assembled in precise formation before the great doors, a sea of black and white uniforms and carefully neutral expressions, and Eleanor felt their eyes upon her as she walked the gauntlet of their assessment, knowing they were measuring her against the ghost of the woman who had come before, the woman whose portrait she had glimpsed in the gallery, the woman whose death had turned their master to stone. Mrs. Agnes Hartwell stood at the head of the line, a tall woman with iron-grey hair pulled back severely from a face that might have been handsome once, and was now merely formidable, her dark eyes sharp with an intelligence that missed nothing as she curtsied and murmured, "Welcome to Thornfield, Your Grace," in a voice that offered respect without warmth, acknowledgment without acceptance. The Duke led Eleanor through the great doors and into a world that smelled of wood smoke and furniture polish and old books, scents that she would later learn clung to every room because of his habit of standing before the fires while lost in thought, and she followed him through corridors and chambers that blurred together in her overwhelmed mind. The library with its towering shelves and comfortable chairs positioned near a massive fireplace, the drawing rooms with their elegant proportions and heavy silk draperies, the portrait gallery through which he moved without pausing, without glancing at any of the painted faces that watched their passage with oil-rendered eyes. Her private chambers, when they reached them at last, were more beautiful than anything she had ever called her own. Walls papered in soft sage green, curtains of cream silk, a bed hung with embroidered fabric that looked as though it had been chosen with care rather than merely expense, and she noticed with a strange flutter in her chest that someone had placed fresh flowers on the writing desk, positioned near the window for good light, had arranged books on the bedside table as though anticipating that she might want to read before sleeping. "If you require anything," the Duke said from the doorway, his voice as clipped and formal as ever, "Mrs. Hartwell will attend to it, and I dine at 8. You are welcome to join me or take your meals privately as you prefer, for I will not force my company upon you." He indicated a door set into the wall between 2 windows, a door she had not noticed until that moment. "That connects to my chambers, but it locks from your side, and I will not enter without your explicit invitation." Then he was gone, his footsteps retreating down the corridor, and Eleanor stood alone in the center of her beautiful new prison, surrounded by evidence of thoughtfulness she had not expected from a man who claimed to feel nothing. She sat on the edge of the bed and pressed her fingertips together in her lap, feeling the familiar ache of that gesture, then consciously, deliberately, relaxed them, spreading her fingers open against her skirts in a small act of will, a tiny rebellion against the fear that threatened to overwhelm her, and she whispered to the empty room, "I can do this. I can make a life here. I can be content with what I have been given." Though even as she spoke the words, she was not entirely certain she believed them. The morning Eleanor accompanied the Duke to visit his tenants dawned cool and bright, the kind of spring day that seemed to promise something she dared not name, and she sat beside him in the open carriage as it wound through the estate's rolling lands, watching the way he held the reins with those large, scarred hands she had noticed from the first moment they met, hands that had steadied her in the lurching carriage on their wedding day and left warmth imprinted on her skin for hours afterward. He had explained her duty with his usual brevity. The Duchess of Thornfield was expected to know her tenants, to understand their needs, to be a presence in their lives beyond mere abstraction, and Eleanor had agreed with the quiet dignity she had perfected over years of disappointment, expecting nothing more than formal introductions and distant courtesies. The lord, surveying his domain with his new acquisition, displayed appropriately at his side. What she found instead unsettled everything she thought she understood about the man she had married. He knew them, truly knew them, called old Samuel Barton by name, and asked after his wife's rheumatism, discussed the drainage problems in the lower fields with young William Thorne, as though they were equals puzzling through a shared concern, crouched down to accept a handful of wildflowers from a gap-toothed girl named Bessie, who giggled and hid behind her mother's skirts. Eleanor watched him move through the village with a growing sense of disorientation, as though she had been handed a book in a language she thought she knew, and discovered the words meant something entirely different than she had assumed. At the cottage of a family named Fletcher, they found chaos. A woman weeping at the door, a man pacing with his cap crushed between his hands, and inside, a physician bent over a small figure on a pallet near the fire. The Duke did not hesitate, did not pause to consider his fine clothes or his dignity or the proper distance a man of his station should maintain. He strode past the distraught parents and knelt in the dirt beside the sick child, heedless of the rough wool blankets and the smell of fever and fear that hung heavy in the cramped space. Eleanor remained in the doorway, unseen, unable to move, unable to look away, as she watched him take the boy's small hand in his large, scarred one, the same hands that had touched her so briefly, so carefully, and heard him speak in a voice she had never heard from him before, low and rough and impossibly tender. "Listen to me, Thomas," he said to the frightened child, whose eyes were too bright with fever and terror. "The bravest knights are not those who feel no fear, but those who are afraid and stand firm anyway, and you are being very brave, braver than you know." He stayed there through the worst of it, telling stories of noble quests and fearsome dragons, while the physician worked, his thumb brushing across the boy's knuckles in that unconscious gesture she was beginning to recognize. And when at last the fever broke, and Thomas's mother sobbed with relief, the Duke rose and moved toward the door with his expression already shuttering back into its familiar sternness, the walls rebuilding themselves before Eleanor's eyes. He did not know she had witnessed any of it, did not see her pressed against the door frame with her fingertips aching from how hard she had pressed them together, did not notice the way she looked at him as though seeing him for the first time. Something shifted in her chest as they rode back to Thornfield in silence, something warm and dangerous that she immediately tried to suppress, telling herself it was merely respect for a landlord who cared for his people, nothing more than admiration for unexpected kindness, certainly not the first tender shoot of something that felt terrifyingly like hope pushing up through the frozen ground of her guarded heart. Eleanor had settled into a quiet routine in the 2 weeks since her wedding, a rhythm of solitary breakfasts taken in her chambers while the morning light crept across the sage-green walls, of long hours in the library where she lost herself among the towering shelves and discovered treasures she had never dreamed of reading, of dinners with the Duke in the formal dining room, where they sat at opposite ends of a table that could seat 30, and exchanged careful, polite conversation about the weather and the estate, and nothing that truly mattered. And yet she had begun to look forward to those dinners more than she should, had begun to listen for the particular cadence of his footsteps in the corridor, had begun to notice the way his dark blue eyes sometimes lingered on her face when he thought she was not watching. And she told herself firmly that this was merely the natural consequence of proximity, of having no other companion in this vast and beautiful house, certainly not the first stirrings of something she had sworn never to feel again. Today, she had ventured out to explore the grounds, wrapped in a light shawl against the mild afternoon air, and the patches of sunlight breaking through the clouds seemed to promise something she dared not name as she walked along a path that wound toward a glittering lake she had glimpsed from her window, and she was so absorbed in the beauty of the landscape, the ancient oaks with their spreading branches, the wildflowers dotting the meadow grass, the distant hills rolling toward the horizon, that she did not hear the Duke's approach until his voice came from behind her, low and steady. "You have found the lake path." She turned to find him standing there in his riding clothes, having evidently just returned from the stables, and something in her chest fluttered at the sight of him, at the way the sunlight caught the strong lines of his jaw and softened the stern set of his mouth. "It is beautiful," she said, and her voice came out softer than she intended. "I did not realize the estate extended so far." He fell into step beside her without invitation, his long stride adjusting to match her shorter one, and for a time they walked in silence that was not quite comfortable but not cold either, weighted with all the things neither of them knew how to say. He asked about her reading. She had been working through a collection of essays on natural philosophy, and she asked about the estate, and he answered with more words than she had yet heard him string together, speaking of drainage improvements and the new mill and the family of swans that returned to the lake each spring, and Eleanor found herself relaxing slightly, her shoulders loosening, her hands resting open at her sides rather than pressed together in her habitual gesture of anxiety. Then the attack came without warning. A furious honking erupted from the underbrush, and a large grey goose burst forth like some feathered demon, wings spread wide, orange beak aimed directly at Eleanor's ankles with murderous intent. She scrambled backward with a startled cry, all dignity abandoned, her skirts tangling around her legs as she retreated from the advancing menace, and she was dimly aware that she must look utterly ridiculous, the Duchess of Thornfield fleeing in terror from a barnyard fowl, but the creature was relentless, pursuing her with a determination that seemed almost personal. And then she heard it, a sound so unexpected that it stopped her mid-flight, made her turn and stare with her mouth falling open in astonishment. The Duke was laughing. It was a genuine laugh, warm and surprised and utterly transforming, erasing the stern lines around his eyes and softening the hard set of his mouth into something almost boyish. And Eleanor was so startled by the change in him, by this glimpse of the man who must have existed before grief built its walls around his heart, that she forgot entirely about the goose, which promptly nipped her skirt with vindictive satisfaction. His laughter faded into a smile that lingered in his dark blue eyes, warming them to that deep sapphire she had only glimpsed in rare, unguarded moments. "I believe you have met Wellington," he said, and there was a thread of amusement still woven through his voice that made her heart do something complicated in her chest. "He terrorizes everyone." He stepped forward and extended his hand to help her straighten her skirts, and when she took it, His fingers were warm and steady around hers, and he did not release her immediately, but stood there for a moment, with her hand in his thumb brushing almost absently across her knuckles. "My head groom named him after the Iron Duke," he continued, and there was a glint of dry humour in his eyes that she had never seen before. "He claims the resemblance in temperament is striking." Eleanor laughed. She could not help it, and the sound seemed to surprise them both, seemed to hang in the air between them like something precious and fragile, and for a moment they were simply two people sharing amusement on a mild afternoon, with patches of sunlight breaking through the clouds, and something dangerous bloomed in Eleanor's chest, something that felt terrifyingly like hope. The greenhouse stood at the far edge of the formal gardens like something forgotten, its iron frame elegant beneath the creeping rust, its glass panels clouded with years of neglect, and the grey afternoon light filtering through in muted, dreamlike shafts that illuminated the tangle of overgrown vines and withered blooms within. And Eleanor had discovered it quite by accident, while wandering the grounds alone, drawn by the shape of it rising from behind a hedge of untrimmed boxwood, beautiful even in its decay, and she had pushed open the door with effort, the hinges protesting with a groan that seemed to echo through the humid, earthy air inside. And she had stood for a long moment simply breathing it in, the smell of damp soil and green things struggling to survive, the ghost of what this place must once have been visible in the bones of the structure, in the careful arrangement of raised beds now choked with weeds, in the remnants of a climbing rose that still clung stubbornly to a trellis, though its blooms had long since died. She was touching the withered petals of that rose, her fingers gentle on the papery remnants of something that had once been lovely, when she heard footsteps behind her and turned to find Mrs. Hartwell standing in the doorway, the housekeeper's expression shifting through something complicated before settling into careful neutrality. "I wondered if you might find your way here eventually, Your Grace," Mrs. Hartwell said, stepping inside and looking around with eyes that saw not what was, but what had been. It was Lady Sophia's project, this greenhouse. She had such plans for it, wanted to grow orchids and orange trees and all manner of impossible things, and His Grace indulged her every whim because he could deny her nothing, not when she smiled at him the way she did. Eleanor's heart clenched at the name spoken aloud, at the confirmation of what she had only suspected, and she asked her questions carefully, not prying, but seeking to understand the man she had married, and the shadows that lived behind his eyes. Mrs. Hartwell answered with the particular candor of a woman who had watched a boy grow into a man, who had witnessed his greatest joy and his most devastating loss, and her words painted a picture of a love match that had been the envy of society, of a young duchess who had been kind and lively and adored by everyone who knew her, of a death in childbirth that had taken both mother and son and left the Duke standing in the wreckage of everything he had built his happiness upon. "He hasn't been the same since," Mrs. Hartwell said quietly, and there was grief in her voice too, the grief of someone who had loved them both. "He built walls so high I feared no one would ever reach him again." She paused, and when she spoke again, there was something new in her tone, something almost like hope. "But he hasn't smiled like that since before Lady Sophia passed, Your Grace. That laugh by the lake, when Wellington chased you, the staff saw it from the windows and could scarcely believe. You've brought something back to life in this house." Eleanor did not know what to say, did not know how to hold the weight of that observation alongside her own tangled feelings. So she turned back to the greenhouse and walked slowly through its neglected paths, trailing her fingers along the edges of empty pots and bare soil, and found herself speaking almost to herself, her voice soft with memory. "My mother grew white camellias," she said, and the words came out before she could stop them, carrying with them the ache of loss she usually kept carefully contained. They were her favorite flower. She had an entire bed of them in our garden, and she would cut them for the house every week when they were in bloom. And after she died, I used to sit beneath that tree and pretend I could still smell her perfume in the petals. She did not see Mrs. Hartwell's expression sharpen with interest, did not notice the thoughtful look that crossed the housekeeper's face as she filed this small, vulnerable admission away, did not know that her words would travel from this neglected greenhouse to ears that listened for any detail about what might please her, what might make her smile, what might begin to fill the emptiness she carried so quietly inside her. Eleanor could not sleep, and she had stopped pretending to herself that the restlessness plaguing her had anything to do with the unfamiliarity of her chambers or the distant rumble of thunder that had been threatening all evening without breaking, because she knew with a clarity that frightened her that it was him keeping her awake. The Duke, Henry, whose name she still did not speak aloud, but which she turned over in her mind like a precious stone she had no right to hold, and she found herself thinking of the way his rare smiles transformed his stern face, of the tenderness she had witnessed when he knelt beside a sick child in a tenant's cottage, of the warmth that crept into his dark blue eyes when he looked at her across the dinner table and thought she did not notice. And these thoughts were dangerous, she knew, because she had promised herself she would expect nothing and hope for nothing. And yet here she was, lying in the darkness, with her heart full of something she dared not name, and finally she rose from her bed and wrapped herself in a shawl and slipped out into the corridor, telling herself she merely needed to walk, to tire her restless mind, to escape the confines of her own treacherous thoughts. The great house was silent around her, the servants long since retired, and her bare feet made no sound on the thick carpets as she wandered through the darkened halls, past doors she had learned to recognize, past the library where she spent so many hours among the books that smelled of leather and age, and something that reminded her inexplicably of him. And she did not realize where her feet were carrying her until she saw the faint glow of candlelight spilling from an open doorway ahead, and she recognized with a start that she had found her way to the portrait gallery, the long room lined with generations of Blackwell ancestors that the Duke had shown her so briefly on her first day, moving through it with a haste that had seemed strange to her then, but which she now understood with painful clarity. She should have turned back, should have retreated to her chambers and left him to whatever private grief had drawn him here in the dead of night, but something held her frozen at the edge of the doorway, something that made her press herself against the wall and peer around the frame with a held breath, and what she saw there shattered something inside her chest that she had not known was still whole. He stood before a portrait she had not noticed during that first hurried tour, a painting of a woman with dark hair and laughing eyes, and a smile that seemed to hold all the joy in the world. And Eleanor knew without being told that this was Lady Sophia, the first Duchess, the woman he had loved and lost, and the Duke stood before her image, with his shoulders bowed beneath a weight of grief so profound that Eleanor felt tears prick her own eyes in response. His hand rose to touch the gilded frame, and his fingers trembled as they traced the painted curve of his dead wife's cheek, and his face in the candlelight was stripped of every wall he had built, every mask he wore, leaving only raw and devastating sorrow. And Eleanor had never seen anyone look so utterly, completely alone. She retreated silently, her hand pressed to her mouth to stifle any sound that might betray her presence, and she fled back through the darkened corridors to her own chambers with her heart pounding and her eyes burning with unshed tears. And when she finally reached her bed, she sat on its edge and pressed her fingertips together in her lap, and understood at last why he had told her he could not promise love, not because he was incapable of it, but because he had loved so deeply and lost so devastatingly that the very thought of risking such pain again must terrify him beyond bearing. And something cracked open in Eleanor's chest, something fierce and protective and aching. Not romantic love, Not yet, but a tenderness so profound it stole her breath, and she knew in that moment that she would never speak of what she had witnessed, would never intrude upon his private grief, but she would carry the image of his trembling hand and bowed shoulders with her always, and she would understand him now in ways she had not before, and perhaps, if she was patient and gentle and brave, she might one day help him learn that love need not always end in devastation. The library had become Eleanor's sanctuary in the weeks since her arrival at Thornfield, a vast and beautiful room where the scent of leather bindings and aged paper mingled with the ever-present undertone of wood smoke that she had come to associate with him. And on this particular afternoon she sat, curled in the window seat, with the worn volume of Shakespeare's sonnets open in her lap, the same book she had discovered weeks ago, with its passages marked in faded ink by some long-ago hand, and she found herself reading aloud in a voice barely above a whisper, the words falling from her lips like a prayer she had not known she needed to speak. "Let me not to the marriage of true minds admit impediments. Love is not love which alters when it alteration finds, or bends with the remover to remove. Oh no, it is an ever-fixed mark that looks on tempests and is never shaken." And the words seemed to echo in the quiet room, settling into the spaces between the towering shelves and the dust motes dancing in the afternoon light. And she did not know that he stood in the doorway behind her, did not hear his footsteps pause on the threshold, or sense the way he leaned against the frame with his arms crossed, and his dark blue eyes fixed upon her with an intensity that would have stolen her breath had she seen it. And when she finally looked up from the page, drawn by some instinct she could not name, the doorway was empty, and yet the book felt different in her hands now, weighted with a significance she could not quite articulate, as though the words she had spoken aloud had travelled somewhere they were meant to go. She was still contemplating this strange feeling when the Duke appeared again, this time entering properly with his usual controlled stride, and his expression was carefully neutral as he informed her that they would be attending a ball in London at the end of the week, a social obligation he could not avoid, and Eleanor felt the words strike her like a physical blow, felt the dread rise up in her chest at the thought of facing the society that had witnessed her humiliation, the whispers and the pitying glances, and worst of all, the possibility of encountering Clarence himself, and her hands pressed together in her lap before she could stop them, her fingertips finding each other in that old familiar gesture of barely contained distress. The Duke's eyes dropped to her hands, and something flickered across his face, something that might have been understanding, or might have been something deeper. And when he spoke again, his voice was lower, less clipped than usual, and he said, "You will be magnificent, Eleanor. Society will see what I see." And then he was gone before she could respond, before she could ask him what exactly it was that he saw when he looked at her, and she was left sitting in the window seat with her heart pounding and the sonnets forgotten in her lap, and his words echoing in her mind alongside the poetry she had been reading. Mrs. Hartwell found her there an hour later and took one look at her face and seemed to understand everything, and the housekeeper's manner was warm now, conspiratorial almost, as she helped Eleanor prepare in the days that followed, ensuring that the gown of deep blue silk that had arrived without explanation or comment fit perfectly, adjusting the delicate gold locket at Eleanor's throat, the one containing the miniature portrait of his mother that he had given her after their wedding. And as Eleanor looked at herself in the mirror on the evening of the ball, she consciously relaxed her pressed-together fingers and lifted her chin, and told herself that she was no longer the desperate, humiliated girl who had fled to her mother's camellia tree with her heart in pieces. She was the Duchess of Thornfield now, and whatever awaited her in that London ballroom, she would face it with the dignity her mother had taught her, and the strange, fragile courage that his words had kindled in her chest. The ballroom blazed with the light of 1,000 candles reflected in crystal chandeliers and gilded mirrors, and Eleanor felt the weight of every gaze that turned toward her as she entered on the Duke's arm, felt the whispers ripple through the crowd like wind through wheat. And she knew what they were saying, knew they were remembering the girl who had been so publicly discarded by Lord Clarence Pemberton 2 years ago, and marvelling at her transformation into the Duchess of Thornfield, and her fingers pressed together where they rested on his sleeve, that old familiar gesture of barely contained distress. But before she could spiral further into her anxiety, she felt his hand cover hers, warm and steady and sure, a brief pressure that said without words that she was not alone, that he was here, that he would not let her fall, and she drew a breath and lifted her chin and reminded herself that she was no longer the desperate, humiliated girl who had fled to her mother's camellia tree with her heart in pieces. She was his wife now, his duchess, and she would not shame him or herself by cowering before the very society that had once pitied her. They moved through the crowd together, and Eleanor was acutely aware of the picture they must present. The tall, powerful Duke with his stern face and dark blue eyes that seemed to dare anyone to speak a word against the woman on his arm, and she in her gown of deep blue silk that he had chosen for her, the delicate gold locket warm against her throat, and she saw the way people stepped back to let them pass, saw the respect and perhaps even fear in their eyes when they looked at him, and she thought that perhaps this was what it meant to be protected, to be claimed, to belong to someone who would stand between her and the world without hesitation. Lady Beatrice found them near the refreshment table, her sharp eyes gleaming with something that might have been approval as she looked Eleanor up and down and said, "You look magnificent, child. I knew that gown would suit you." And Eleanor felt a flush of warmth at the older woman's words, at the way Lady Beatrice had become something almost like an ally in the weeks since the wedding, and then Lady Beatrice's gaze shifted to something over Eleanor's shoulder, and her expression hardened almost imperceptibly, and Eleanor knew before she turned what she would see. Clarence approached with Arabella on his arm, and Eleanor felt her stomach clench at the sight of him, at the golden hair still artfully arranged, and the features still symmetrical and pleasing, and the smile that still did not reach his pale blue eyes. And she noticed with a strange, distant clarity the way his hand went to his cravat, adjusting it in that nervous gesture she had once found endearing and now recognized as the tell of a man who was about to lie. And beside him Arabella was beautiful, in the way of a painting left too long in the sun, her loveliness faded by discontent, her eyes hard and bored as they swept over Eleanor with barely concealed resentment. "Your Grace," Clarence said, and his voice was smooth as silk and just as slippery. "What a pleasure to see you both. May I offer my congratulations on your marriage, and Eleanor, my dear, what a remarkable fortune you have had to secure such a match after everything." And Eleanor felt the barb slide between her ribs like a knife, felt the old humiliation rise up in her throat, but before she could respond, before she could find the words to defend herself, the Duke spoke, and his voice was quiet, but it carried, cutting through the noise of the ballroom like a blade through butter. "The fortune," he said, and his dark blue eyes were fixed on Clarence, with an intensity that made the other man take an involuntary step backward, "is entirely mine, Pemberton. I am the one who secured a wife of grace, intelligence, and worth beyond measure, and I am well aware that I do not deserve her." And Clarence's smile faltered, his hand going again to his cravat, and he attempted to recover with some comment about Eleanor's improved circumstances, but the Duke cut him off with a single freezing look, and words that Eleanor would carry with her for the rest of her life. "You had the opportunity to recognize her value and failed. I will not make the same mistake. Come, my dear, I believe they are playing a waltz." And he led her away onto the dance floor as the music swelled around them, and Eleanor felt tears prick her eyes, felt something crack open in her chest, felt the last of her walls begin to crumble as he took her in his arms, and they began to move together. and she thought that perhaps, she had been wrong to promise herself she would never hope again. The carriage wheels rattled against the cobblestones as they left the blazing lights of the ballroom behind, and Eleanor sat in the velvet darkness, with her hands trembling in her lap, trembling not with the cold or with fear, but with something she could not quite name, some overwhelming release of tension that had been coiled so tightly within her chest that she had not realized how difficult it had become to breathe. Until this moment when she could finally exhale, and across from her, the Duke sat in his customary silence, his dark blue eyes catching the faint light from the carriage lanterns as he watched her with an expression she could not read. And when she finally found her voice, it came out unsteady, barely above a whisper, as she said, "Thank you for what you said to him, for defending me. I do not know how to—" But he cut her off with a single shake of his head, his voice low and rough when he spoke. "I meant every word, Eleanor. You must know that by now." And the way he said her name, without her title, without formality, sent a shiver down her spine that had nothing to do with the cool night air, and she found she could not look away from him, could not break the thread of tension that seemed to stretch between them in the enclosed space of the carriage, the scent of sandalwood and leather surrounding her like an embrace she had not known she craved. When they arrived at Thornfield, the great house rose before them in the darkness, and neither of them suggested retiring to their separate chambers, and so they found themselves in the drawing-room, where the fire had been kept burning against their return, the flames casting dancing shadows across the walls as the first rumble of thunder echoed in the distance. And the Duke poured brandy for himself from the crystal decanter on the sideboard, and after a moment's hesitation, he poured a smaller measure into a second glass and offered it to her. And when she took it, their fingers brushed, and neither pulled away, the touch lingering for a heartbeat longer than necessary before he settled into the chair across from her and said with a quietness that invited confidence, "Tell me about Pemberton. Tell me what he did to make you build such walls around yourself." And Eleanor found that she wanted to tell him, wanted him to know the truth of what had made her the woman she was. And so she told him everything. The overheard conversation, the cruel words that had carved themselves into her memory like wounds that would not heal, the humiliation of knowing herself dismissed as pleasant enough but hardly worth keeping, and the vow she had made to herself beneath her mother's camellia tree to never again be foolish enough to hope, to expect nothing and want nothing, and therefore never be wounded so deeply again. He listened without interruption, his dark eyes never leaving her face, and when she finished speaking, the silence stretched between them, broken only by the crackling of the fire and the rain that had begun to lash against the windows, and she saw the muscle flex near his temple, saw his jaw tighten with an anger that was not directed at her, and when he finally spoke, his voice was low and fierce. He was a fool, a blind, mercenary fool who could not see what was before him, and I find I am grateful for his foolishness, because it brought you to me. And the words struck Eleanor like a physical blow, not painful but profound, and she felt something crack open in her chest, felt the walls she had built so carefully begin to crumble, and she thought that perhaps, she had been wrong to make such promises to herself, wrong to believe that hope was foolishness, when it might instead be the beginning of courage. The weeks that followed, the ball unfurled like the petals of the roses now blooming in Thornfield's gardens, each day bringing new warmth and new light. And Eleanor found herself living in a state of heightened awareness that made the colours of the world seem brighter, the air sweeter, the hours both too long and too short, depending on whether she was in his presence. And she could no longer pretend that the quickening of her pulse when she heard his footsteps in the corridor was anything other than what it was, could no longer deny that she listened for the deep rumble of his voice, the way a flower turns toward the sun. And it terrified her in ways she had not been terrified since that afternoon beneath her mother's camellia tree, when she had promised herself she would never hope again. They spent their mornings in the library now, a habit that had developed without either of them acknowledging it. Eleanor curled in the chair by the window with her book while he worked at the great mahogany desk, and sometimes she would look up to find his dark blue eyes already upon her, watching her with an expression she could not quite name, before he returned his attention to his papers. And sometimes she caught herself staring at the way the light fell across his hands as he wrote, those large, scarred, capable hands that had steadied her in the carriage and covered hers at the ball and haunted her dreams in ways she refused to examine too closely. The small gestures accumulated like treasures she hoarded in her heart. The way he remembered that she took her tea with honey and ensured the kitchen always had it ready. The way he brought her books he thought she would enjoy and left them on her chair without comment. The way he positioned himself between her and any draught when they walked the grounds together in the early summer warmth, the flowers blooming around them in riots of colour that seemed to mirror something blooming within her chest, dangerous and beautiful and impossible to contain. One morning she came down to breakfast to find a first edition of Wordsworth's poems beside her plate, and when she looked at him in question he merely said, "You mentioned admiring his work," as though it were nothing, as though remembering a passing comment she had made weeks ago and acting upon it were not the most romantic gesture anyone had ever made toward her, and she had to press her fingertips together beneath the table to keep from weeping with the tenderness of it. Mrs. Hartwell found her in the corridor later that day, and the housekeeper's eyes were knowing as she said, "He watches you when you're not looking, Your Grace. He hasn't watched anyone like that in 7 years." And Eleanor's heart pounded so fiercely she thought it might escape her chest entirely, and she wanted to believe, wanted it with a desperation that frightened her. But she was afraid that she was seeing what she wished to see, rather than what was truly there, afraid that the vow she had made to expect nothing had been the only thing protecting her from devastation, and she had let it crumble without building anything to take its place. That night she lay awake in her chambers, the connecting door to his rooms a presence she could not ignore, and she pressed her hands together in the darkness and admitted to herself what she had been denying for weeks. She loved him completely and terrifyingly, and with every corner of her foolish, hoping heart, and she had no idea if he could ever love her back. Eleanor could no longer bear the weight of not knowing, could no longer endure the exquisite torture of watching him across the dinner table and wondering if the warmth she saw in his dark blue eyes was real or merely a reflection of her own desperate longing. And so on this evening, when the sky had turned the colour of bruises, and the first distant thunder rolled across the hills like a warning or a promise, she found herself walking through the corridors of Thornfield toward his study, with her heart hammering against her ribs, and her hands pressed so tightly together that her fingers ached. And when she reached the heavy oak door, she paused for only a moment before pushing it open, and there he was, standing before the fire as she had known he would be, the flames casting dancing shadows across his broad shoulders and illuminating the planes of his face in gold and amber, and the scent of sandalwood and leather and wood smoke wrapped around her like an embrace as she stepped into the room. And when he turned to look at her, something shifted in his expression, something raw and hungry that he quickly suppressed behind the familiar mask of control. But she had seen it, and that glimpse of unguarded feeling gave her the courage to speak. "I must ask you something," she said, and her voice was steadier than she had expected, though softer, barely audible above the crackling of the fire and the rumble of approaching thunder. "And I need you to answer me honestly, even if the answer is not what I wish to hear." And he watched her with those dark eyes that missed nothing, the muscle near his temple flexing as his jaw tightened, and he said nothing, only waited, and so she forced herself to continue. "Do you ever think of me as more than a practical arrangement, more than a solution to a problem you needed solved?" The silence that followed her question stretched between them like a living thing, and Eleanor felt her heart plummeting, felt the familiar cold certainty of rejection beginning to creep through her veins, and she was already preparing herself for the polite deflection, the gentle reminder of the terms they had agreed upon, when he spoke, and his voice was rough, almost hoarse, as though the words were being torn from somewhere deep within him. "I think of you constantly. I think of you when I should be working, when I should be attending to the affairs of the estate, when I should be doing anything other than wondering what you are reading in the library, or whether you smiled at something Mrs. Hartwell said, or how the light falls across your face when you stand by the window in the morning." And Eleanor's breath caught in her throat as he continued, his hands curling into fists at his sides in that gesture she had come to recognize as the sign of emotion forcibly restrained. "I think of you when I wake, and when I try to sleep. And you have become essential to me in ways I did not anticipate, and do not know how to express. And I am afraid," he said, taking a single step toward her, and then stopping as though an invisible barrier held him back. "I am afraid of wanting you this much." The storm broke overhead, rain beginning to lash against the windows, and Eleanor felt tears prick at her eyes as she looked at this man who had built such walls around his wounded heart, this man who had lost so much and feared to lose again, and she took a step toward him, closing the distance he could not bring himself to cross, and whispered, "So am I." The storm broke over Thornfield as he took her hand, and Eleanor felt the thunder roll through her bones as his fingers closed around hers with a gentleness that made her throat ache, and without a word he led her from the study through the darkened corridors of the great house, past the sleeping portraits and the flickering sconces, and she followed him in trembling silence until they reached a door she had not seen him open in all her weeks at Thornfield. And when he pushed it wide, she understood at once where he had brought her. The greenhouse, but transformed, no longer the neglected ruin she had wandered through with Mrs. Hartwell, but something living and luminous. The glass panels cleaned until they shone like crystal, the iron frames restored to their former elegance, and everywhere, white camellias bloomed in glorious profusion, their petals gleaming like pearls in the lamplight that someone had placed throughout the space, and the rain thundered against the glass above them like a heartbeat, like applause, like the breaking of everything she had tried to hold back. And Eleanor pressed her free hand to her mouth as tears spilled down her cheeks, because he had remembered. He had listened to a single passing comment she had made weeks ago about her mother's garden, and he had done this, had created this sanctuary of memory and beauty, and he had never said a word. "I told you I could not promise love," he said, and his voice was rough, almost broken, as he turned to face her among the flowers he had grown for her, his dark blue eyes no longer cold, but burning with something that stole her breath. "I was wrong. I was a coward and a fool, Eleanor, and I have been fighting this since the moment you stumbled in that carriage, and I touched you, and felt my whole world shift on its axis. And I told myself it was impossible, that I had buried my heart with Sophia, and there was nothing left to give. But you—" His voice cracked, and he lifted his hand to cup her face, his thumb brushing across her cheekbone where the beauty mark lay. That gesture of memorizing she had come to recognize. "You brought me back to life without even trying. You with your quiet dignity and your grey eyes that see everything, and your courage that humbles me. And I love you. I love you in a way I did not know I was still capable of feeling. And I protect what is mine, Eleanor. You are mine. But I find—" He drew a shaking breath and pressed his forehead to hers, the rain a symphony above them, the camellias witnesses to his surrender. "I find I am also entirely yours." She was weeping openly now, her hands pressed flat against his chest, where she could feel his heart hammering as wildly as her own, and she thought of Sonnet 116, of love that does not alter when it alteration finds, and she whispered, "Love is not love which alters when it alteration finds." and something in his expression shattered and reformed into wonder as he realized she was giving him the words back, the words he had heard her read aloud in the library. And then his mouth found hers, and Eleanor discovered that all the poetry in the world was nothing compared to this, to the taste of him, to the way his arms wrapped around her as though he would never let go, to the storm raging outside and the peace blooming within. And when they finally broke apart, breathless and trembling, her hands had fallen open at her sides, relaxed and unguarded for the first time since that terrible afternoon beneath her mother's camellia tree, and she knew with absolute certainty that she had finally come home. The rain lashed against the windows of his chambers as he drew her through the connecting door she had never seen opened, and Eleanor felt the threshold pass beneath her feet like a crossing into some new country from which there would be no return. And she did not want to return. She wanted only this, only him, only the way his hands trembled as he turned to face her in the firelit darkness of the room that smelled of sandalwood and leather and wood smoke, the scent that had become her anchor, her safety, her home. And when he cupped her face in those large, scarred, impossibly gentle hands, and looked at her with eyes that burned like sapphires in the flickering light, she felt the last of her walls crumble into dust and blow away like petals in a storm. And he said her name, just her name, Eleanor, in that low, rough voice that she had come to crave like breath. And she rose on her toes and pressed her lips to his. And the kiss was nothing like the first desperate collision in the greenhouse. It was slow and deep and reverent, a promise made flesh, and his thumb brushed across her cheekbone where her beauty mark lay, that gesture of memorizing, of claiming, of cherishing, and she thought of all the moments that had led to this one, the carriage where his hand had steadied her elbow and she had felt his warmth for hours afterward, the goose that had made him laugh and transformed his stern face into something beautiful, the portrait gallery where she had witnessed his grief and understood the depth of his capacity for love, the greenhouse filled with white camellias that he had grown for her without ever speaking a word of it. And she understood now that he had been loving her in actions long before he could speak it aloud, that every book he brought her, and every draught he shielded her from, and every time he positioned himself between her and the world had been a declaration, and when he lifted her as though she weighed nothing and carried her to the bed where the firelight danced across the linens, she was not afraid, she was not guarded, she was not the woman who had sat beneath her mother's camellia tree and promised herself never to hope again, because hope was not foolishness, hope was courage, and he had made her brave. And later, much later, when the storm had gentled to a soft rain, and she lay in his arms with her head on his chest, and his heart beat steady beneath her ear, and his fingers tracing idle patterns on her bare shoulder, she thought of that promise she had made to herself in the garden 2 years ago, the promise to expect nothing, to hope for nothing, to protect herself from ever being wounded so deeply again. And she knew now that she had been wrong, so terribly wrong, because the walls she had built to keep out pain had also kept out joy. And this man, this stern and tender and wounded man who held her as though she were the most precious thing in all the world, had shown her that love was worth the risk, that some things were worth hoping for, and she pressed her lips to his chest and whispered, "I love you," and felt his arms tighten around her, felt his breath catch, felt his lips press against her hair as he murmured back, "And I you, Eleanor, more than I have words to tell you, more than I knew I could feel again." And the rain continued to fall against the windows, washing the world clean, and Eleanor closed her eyes and let herself rest in the shelter of his embrace, knowing that whatever storms might come, she would never face them alone again. The ball at Hartwell House blazed with the light of 10,000 candles, and Eleanor stood at the entrance on Henry's arm, her heart so full she thought it might overflow, because this was not the same woman who had entered a London ballroom 2 months ago, with dread coiling in her stomach and her fingers pressed together in anxious anticipation of humiliation. This was a woman transformed, a woman beloved, a woman who wore the Blackwell sapphires at her throat and the gold locket containing his mother's portrait against her heart, and the unmistakable glow of happiness in her grey eyes that made strangers turn to look and whisper, not with malice, but with wonder, at the change in the stern Duke of Thornfield, who stood beside her with his hand covering hers on his arm, in that gesture of possession and protection that had become as natural as breathing. And when they descended the stairs into the glittering throng, Eleanor felt his thumb brush across her knuckles, in that way he had of memorizing her, of claiming her, of silently saying, "I am here, and I am yours, and nothing in this room can touch you." And she lifted her chin and smiled, truly smiled, because she was no longer afraid of society's judgment, or Clarence's cruelty, or the whispers of those who had once pitied her reduced circumstances. And as they moved through the crowd, she saw faces turn toward them with expressions ranging from curiosity to envy to genuine warmth. And she saw Lady Beatrice Montgomery holding court near the refreshment table, her sharp eyes finding Eleanor's across the room with a knowing glint that spoke of prophecies fulfilled. And when Henry led her onto the dance floor for the first waltz, his hand warm and steady at her waist, his dark blue eyes soft with an emotion he no longer tried to hide, Eleanor caught Lady Beatrice raising her glass with a smile that curved like a cat's, her lips forming the words, "I told you so," with obvious satisfaction. And Eleanor laughed, actually laughed, a sound of pure joy that made Henry's eyes crinkle at the corners and his arm tighten around her waist. And across the room she saw Clarence Pemberton watching them with an expression of bitter regret, his wife Arabella flirting openly with a young officer, while Clarence stood alone and diminished. His golden handsomeness faded into something petulant and small, and Eleanor felt nothing, not triumph, not vindication, not even pity, only a vast and peaceful indifference because he no longer mattered, because she had found something so much greater than anything he could have offered. And when the music swelled, and Henry pulled her closer than was strictly proper, his lips brushing her ear as he murmured, "I love you, Eleanor, and I want everyone in this room to know it." She felt tears prick her eyes, even as she smiled, and she whispered back, "Then show them." And he did, stopping in the middle of the dance floor to cup her face in his large, scarred, impossibly gentle hands, and kiss her before all of London society. A kiss that was tender and fierce and utterly scandalous and absolutely perfect, and the gasps and whispers that rippled through the ballroom were nothing compared to the thundering of her heart as she kissed him back, her hands resting open and relaxed against his chest. And when they finally parted, breathless and flushed, the Duke of Thornfield looked down at his Duchess with an expression of such naked adoration that even the most hardened gossips fell silent. And Eleanor knew that she had finally, irrevocably, become exactly what she had always secretly longed to be, truly seen, truly valued, truly loved. 3 years had passed since that night, when the rain washed the world clean, and Eleanor Blackwell discovered that hope was not foolishness, but courage. And on this brilliant morning in late summer, she stood at the nursery window of Thornfield Manor, with her infant daughter cradled against her chest, watching Henry cross the sunlit lawn below with their 2-year-old son perched upon his shoulders, the child's delighted laughter carrying up through the open window like music. And Eleanor pressed her lips to the downy head of the baby in her arms, and breathed in that sweet, powdery scent that she had come to love as fiercely as she loved the sandalwood and leather that still made her heart quicken whenever her husband drew near. And she thought of the woman she had been 4 years ago, the woman who had sat beneath her mother's camellia tree with fallen petals scattered around her like tears, and promised herself never to hope again, and she wanted to reach back through time and take that wounded girl's hands and tell her that the wall she was building would not protect her, but imprison her, that the love she feared was the very thing that would save her. And as if summoned by her thoughts, Henry looked up toward the window and found her there. And even from this distance she could see the way his stern face softened, the way his dark blue eyes warmed to that deep sapphire that was hers alone. And he lifted their son's small hand and helped him wave to her. And Eleanor waved back with tears pricking her eyes, because she had never imagined she could be this happy, had never dared to dream that a marriage born of practicality and desperation could become this sanctuary of tenderness and passion and quiet, steadfast devotion. And later that afternoon, when the children were napping and the house was peaceful, Henry found her in the greenhouse, where the white camellias bloomed in glorious profusion. The same greenhouse where he had confessed his love while the storm raged overhead. And he came up behind her and wrapped his arms around her waist and buried his face in her hair, and she leaned back against his solid warmth and felt his heartbeat against her spine, and he said in that low, rough voice that still made her breath catch, "I was thinking of that day you agreed to marry me, when I told you I could not promise love." And she turned in his arms and looked up at him, at this man who had given her everything, and she said, "I remember." And he cupped her face in those large, scarred, impossibly gentle hands and brushed his thumb across the beauty mark below her cheekbone. That gesture of memorizing, of cherishing, that had become as familiar and necessary as breathing. And he said, "I was such a fool, Eleanor, to think I could keep my heart from you, to think that any wall I built could withstand what you are." And she rose on her toes and kissed him softly and whispered against his lips, "We were both fools, my love, but we learned." And outside the greenhouse windows, the summer sun blazed golden over Thornfield's grounds, and somewhere in the distance, Wellington the goose was terrorizing a gardener, and in the nursery above their children slept peacefully. And Eleanor Blackwell, who had once believed herself unworthy of love, stood in the arms of the man who had shown her otherwise, and knew with absolute certainty that this was her happily ever after, earned through courage and vulnerability and the terrifying, glorious choice to hope. And so, dear listener, we come to the end of our tale, though perhaps it is not truly an end at all, but rather a beginning. For the story of Eleanor and Henry Blackwell continues still in the halls of Thornfield Manor, where the white camellias bloom in glorious profusion in the greenhouse that was once a monument to grief and has become a sanctuary of joy, where Wellington the goose still terrorizes gardeners and guests alike with equal enthusiasm, where Mrs. Hartwell presides over a household that has been transformed from a place of shadows and silence into a home filled with the laughter of children and the quiet contentment of a love that grew not from the lightning strike of passion, but from the steady, patient cultivation of respect and trust, and the courage to hope when hope seemed foolish. And I have shared this story with you, because I believe, as Eleanor came to believe, that the deepest loves are not always the ones that announce themselves with grand gestures and flowery declarations, but the ones that reveal themselves in small moments, in a hand steadying an elbow in a lurching carriage, in a greenhouse restored without comment, in the quiet words spoken across a dinner table when no one else is listening, in the choice to see someone truly and to let oneself be truly seen in return. And if you have found yourself moved by Eleanor's journey from heartbreak to happiness, from the fallen petals of her mother's camellia tree to the brilliant summer mornings of her life as duchess and mother and beloved wife, then perhaps you might carry with you the knowledge that walls built to protect wounded hearts can also become prisons, that the vow to expect nothing and hope for nothing is not wisdom but fear dressed in sensible clothing, and that somewhere, in the most unexpected of places, and the most unlikely of circumstances, there may be someone waiting who will see your worth when others have failed to recognize it, who will protect what is theirs with fierce and tender devotion, who will quote Shakespeare in a greenhouse while the rain thunders overhead, and mean every word with the whole of their scarred and careful heart. And so I thank you for walking this path with Eleanor, for witnessing her transformation, for believing alongside her that love is not love which alters when it alteration finds. And I leave you with the image of Thornfield Manor bathed in summer light, of Henry Blackwell lifting his son to wave at the woman in the nursery window, of Eleanor pressing her lips to her daughter's downy head and knowing with absolute certainty that she is exactly where she was always meant to be, loved exactly as she always deserved to be loved, brave enough at last to hope.